make a disco pop track in the style of Dua Lipa, The Weeknd, Doja Cat, you know the vibe. This disco pop thing doesn't usually dominate the top 40, but it never goes out of style, and it's always in the top 40 somewhere.
It's fine, it's cool. You can say that we ain't nothing, but you know the truth. And guess I'm the fool. With their arms out like an angel through the bar sunrail. I don't wanna call it love, but you don't wanna call it love. I wanna be the one that I call baby. 'Cause you're so boys and boys. Another shot to stop the feeling. Yeah.
There are a few ways you could go about it, but there are essentially 4 different core elements to a disco pop track. 1, the sounds themselves. The sounds you pick have to be spot on. Now, here we worship at the altar of Oliver as one of the premier producers that fuels the pop music industry and lots of other genres with his samples, especially if you're doing something disco related or anything funky. He's got a ton of sample packs and a ton of samples that sound very, very, very authentic. So we're going to solo these drums and take a look at what we've put in here. First, the kick. This is very much a disco kick. Very tight, very punchy, very dry. And that's very reminiscent of disco music itself. Very tight, punchy drums, super, super thumpy, analog, warm. Added a couple snare layers here. So I've got a thud, kind of a lower snare here. And then I've got this layer here. But we've layered it in just a little bit more quiet under the main disco snare. And of course, it's not going to be disco unless you add the right claps. Very wide, very small, short, tight, but still, again, very punchy. Got them panned very far left and right so that they really fill the space. Now throwing in our hi-hats. I added an extra hi-hat to the left side, panning-wise, so that it offsets the hi-hat loop, which has an open hat, so that open hit at the beginning of each loop really, really sounds accentuated and full. Wanted to make the drum sound a little bit more beefy by adding a floor tom on every second snare. So here's the low tom by itself I have layered behind every second snare. That one I've put a little bit of reverb on to give it some more space. Here's the whole kit by itself now. That floor tom, every second snare really brings the drums to life and gives it a little bit more of like this breathing, organic feel where the drums don't just feel static and kind of like copy and paste repetitive. That plus the claps really brings the drums to life. Later on, we have this bell loop come in, this percussion. These disco pop songs are always going to have some really kind of almost eclectic percussion sound. Sometimes it's like I've seen people live record mason jars, triangle, or of course shakers and tambourines. But here we've got this percussion loop also coming from one of Oliver's packs that is very much borrowed from this disco funk pop style. Got some cowbell in there. Another really key element to disco pop is going to be the bass lines. Now, you can go with the synth bass and have it sound like a very traditional, like Juno, or something that you could use out of like Arturia's V collection that emulates a retro synth. Or what you can do nowadays is find an existing bass plugin like Scarby MM bass to use in Contact from Native Instruments, or finding something from Splice that you can plug right into Serum or Arturia, whatever your synth of choice is, right? Like a Mini Moog or a Jupiter. These were the retro synths that were used. If it wasn't a live bass line, one of these retro synths were used as the bass line. Now, one of the most important things you can do if you're programming a bass part, whether it's a synth bass or whether you're using one of these programmed live bass virtual instruments, is to make sure that you have this very live feel in the bass part. For example, when I program this bass part, I wanted to make sure it had a live feel by adding these ghost notes, right? Like when someone's playing bass, especially in anything funk or disco related, there's going to be these ghost notes where there's these thumped sort of like played notes, but they're not really held out. They're just percussive. You'll notice these short MIDI notes here. Those are basically percussive notes. They're meant to be ghost notes to mimic what a live bass player might play. And then of course I've programmed a part that a live bass player could feasibly play. Right, even throwing like a little bit of a lick in there that I've seen other bass players play and I've heard them play on records or live or something. The more time that you spend working on the bass part, the better. Having a great bass part is foundational to anything you're working on in the disco pop, funk pop world. Another huge part of disco pop is going to be the drum rhythm itself. Disco is usually 4 on the floor. There's going to be some other elements. We talked about the samples that we chose to help bring this track to life, to give it this human sort of organic breathing feel, again, as if it were a live drummer playing the song. You'll notice that we haven't selected anything like 808 related here because, again, in the disco pop world, we really want it to feel nostalgic, so the sounds themselves are going to feel pretty live, which means when you're putting together the rhythm for this, it's not going to feel like an EDM dance pop song because you're not using EDM sounds, you're using disco sounds. That's what's going to make it feel really dancey and still have it live in the disco world instead of in EDM or something. Later on into the chorus here, we've used a couple of extra rhythmic elements to push the song forward, to make it feel like the arrangement is leveling up, adding more energy. So we've added some shaker parts. We've found some other Lindrum samples. Here's that percussion sample with the kick. The next foundational element to making anything disco pop related and having it sound modern, similar to choosing the right bass sound, you want to find the right synth sound. It can be a modern preset, but it should reference synths like Juno or Jupiter or Moog, more specifically a Juno 106 or like a Yamaha DX7 piano. So I went dumpster diving into Splice and found what I felt were really vintage, nostalgic synths to plug right into the song. And then we've got this main lower synth. These are these very lush synths that give it this very modern flair, but the oscillators of these synths are very nostalgic. They call back to the most popular synths of the 70s and 80s. And of course, nothing in pop, disco pop, or funk pop is complete without a great vocal. I've decided to add a little bit of my own flair as a guitarist. I've added some clean guitar because there are some great records out of the 70s and 80s that have awesome guitar parts, right? Think about Nile Rodgers as a guitarist. I tried to channel this very kind of like clean electric guitar for this track.
It's fine, it's cool. You can say that we ain't nothing, but you know the truth. And guess
Let's hear the guitar in the track with the vocal muted. So in the verse, I chose to go with a pretty repetitive part because every time that same part plays, the chord changes are different. So it feels like there's this steady through line of this really energetic, moving guitar part that doesn't feel like it needs to change all the time because everything else around it is changing. It gives it this nice hook that people can latch onto. Now, the final polish that we add production-wise to this that's going to make it feel modern and up-to-date and really, really fresh to people, especially if we're using a lot of sounds that are retro or nostalgic, is to add some modern touches to it. A little bit of sound design, a little bit of sidechain compression to give it this very, very big modern feel. I found this really funky auto-filtered related synth, played a couple notes, and basically I just printed it and chopped up the audio. And in the chorus, it comes in and really mimics the bass line. So that one synth part that sounds like this talking filtered thing mimics the bass line, and then later on I have this lead kind of similar sound that comes in that really is just meant to be ear candy. So kind of simple on its own, but again, in the context of the track, it really pops. No pun intended. So not every space or gap or cavity in the track needs to have something happening in it, but the spaces in the track that do have some ear candy needs to be pretty thoughtful or intentional. Even if you come up with it on the fly and you feel like, oh, boom, that works. That's how I came up with this kind of ear candy part. And I feel like it's pretty interesting without overwhelming people in what they're hearing. And then of course, this last touch, wanted to add a little bit of a retro flair by bringing in this very, very verbed out electro keys part later on in the track in the second verse. Now the final step is to put the final mix polish on everything. So that's adding the sidechain compression and making sure that what needs to be dry and punchy is dry and punchy. And then of course adding in delays and reverbs to really fill out the space, make the track a lot more three-dimensional. So when sidechaining the kick to the bass, I decided to go with my multi-band compression plugin, Pro MB from FabFilter. I'm bringing in the kick through Ascend here. I've got the attack and the release going really, really fast so that it really just ducks the bass part out of the way and brings it right back in as fast as possible so that there's just the right amount of space for the kick to really come through with the bass being out of the way. And as you can see, it's only really affecting anything from about 530 hertz and lower, keeping the higher parts of the bass part still coming through so that people can hear the really exciting higher end stuff coming from the synth bass. So like without it, I really like what's happening in the higher frequencies of the synth bass part, so I don't want to sidechain that. This was a really fun remix to put together. Let me know if you want to see any other remixes like this, where I take something in the top 40, put a disco pop or a funk pop flair to it. So let me know what you want to hear. And that does it for how to put a disco pop track together. If you're a producer or an artist that's looking to level up their music, check out Next Level Producer. It's my course that I've put together. It's over 40 videos of all 12 plus years experience I have, selling over 200 pieces of music to major record labels and production music catalogs. I'm running a sale right now, or if you're looking to save some money, just subscribe to the YouTube channel. Give this a try. Find those sounds, dial them in just right. Go listen to some of the newer disco funk pop. Could be like a Dua Lipa, even some of the BTS, some of the K-pop stuff. Or if you really want to go deep, go listen to Chromeo. Those guys crank out some of my favorite funky stuff. It's very, very dancey, very disco influenced. Go check it out. That's it for me. Peace.